Welcome back to the Chatterbox English, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into something a lot of you have been asking about: how to learn English faster and with less stress. And, we always love to go directly to the source. So you send us a ton of material focused on really practical learning strategies and all those everyday phrases that, real native English speakers actually use. Our mission today is to pull out the most actionable advice from all of this and hopefully help you guys feel more confident and fluent more quickly.
Yeah. The materials you sent over are really a fascinating combination of a kind of fundamental learning approaches, how to build a really strong base, but then also some really interesting insights into the kind of language that people use in everyday situations. So it's kind of like connecting what you might learn in a more formal setting with the reality of actually speaking English day to day.
Absolutely. And let's unpack that. I think kind of the logical place to start is with building that strong base. When you were looking through all this stuff, what were the core strategies that kept popping up for establishing that really firm foundation?
Well, a couple of really key strategies emerged. I think one of the most important ones, and maybe the one that has the most sort of immediate impact, is focusing on everyday vocabulary. And it sounds obvious, but what a lot of the sources emphasize is that by prioritizing the words that you're going to encounter and use most frequently, you can see pretty rapid progress in your ability to both understand and be understood.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we saw some great examples that, I think one of the sources had bread, milk, fruit, vegetables, really simple stuff that connects to your world, right?
Exactly.
Were there any insights into the best ways to learn and actually remember those everyday words?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Some of your materials highlighted a couple of really effective techniques. I think using new vocabulary in kind of simple sentences that are relevant to your own life is huge for making those words stick. So instead of just memorizing a word like apple, maybe you think, I eat an apple every morning. That creates a more meaningful connection. And a lot of the sources also talked about visual aids, like labeling things around your house or using flashcards with pictures to reinforce that vocabulary.
That makes sense, right? You're engaging more senses to try to, solidify it in your mind.
Right.
Beyond individual words, though, what about kind of those foundational phrases to get conversations off the ground? Because even if you have the individual words, if you don't know how to string them together in a natural way.
Absolutely. And that's the next key element that kept coming up. A lot of the sources stress the importance of learning those practical phrases for kind of everyday interactions. So, of course, we have greetings like, how are you? What's your name? But also to think about sort of basic transactions. Can I help you? Or how much does this cost? Mastering these really fundamental building blocks allows you to start engaging in really simple conversations much earlier in your learning journey.
Okay, so we've got focusing on the most relevant vocabulary and those essential conversational phrases. What would you say comes next in terms of laying that strong foundation?
Well, another cornerstone that emerged was the importance of consistent exposure to English content. And, the interesting thing is a lot of the sources indicated that this doesn't have to involve super intense study sessions. It's more about integrating English into your daily routine. So listening to podcasts designed for English language learners, watching movies or shows with subtitles, at least initially, or even just short, engaging videos on topics that you actually enjoy. All of these help your ear become attuned to the sounds and rhythm of English in a more passive way.
Right. And the advice is always, or often, I guess I should say, to start with content that's at your level, right?
Absolutely.
Don't jump into something that's way too complex. What are some of the telltale signs that you're ready to kind of level up a little bit? How can people kind of gauge their progress?
That's a great question. I think one key indicator is your level of comprehension. If you're consistently understanding, like, a significant portion of kind of the beginner content, without too much effort, that's a pretty good sign that you might be ready to, level up a little bit. And you'll also start to notice that you're picking up new words and phrases more easily. Don't be afraid to try something a little more advanced and see how much you can grasp. And if it feels totally overwhelming, then you can always go back to something a little bit easier. It's really about, keeping yourself challenged, but not totally discouraged.
Okay. Consistent listening. We hear that a lot. Now, speaking is often where people, feel the most hesitant.
Yeah.
What kind of advice did you see for tackling speaking, which for a lot of people is the scariest part?
A lot of the sources were really encouraging about practicing speaking regularly, even if it feels super awkward or uncomfortable at first. And one thing they emphasized a lot was you don't even necessarily need a conversation partner to start. So, talking to yourself, maybe describing your day, narrating your actions as you do them, like you were saying earlier with I'm chopping the onions. Those are all really valuable ways to get your mouth moving and to just build that confidence and forming those English sentences.
I love that tip about narrating actions. That to me seems like such a practical way to connect the vocabulary, with the physical world. Were there any other kind of solo practice techniques that stood out?
Yeah. Another suggestion was recording yourself speaking. And I know that might feel a little strange, but it really allows you to kind of identify any areas where you might be struggling with pronunciation or a sentence structure.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can listen back and focus on improving those areas.
Makes sense.
And, even just thinking in English throughout the day, even if you're not speaking out loud, can be really helpful in just kind of internalizing the language.
Yeah. Meaning a more of an active part of your kind of mental landscape.
Mm-hmm.
What about reading? A lot of people are big readers. What does that contribute to faster, less stressful learning?
Well, reading regularly in English is really crucial for expanding your vocabulary, deepening your understanding of grammar, and it happens in a much more kind of natural and contextual way than if you're just studying grammar rules in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of sources recommended choosing material that really genuinely interests you. So it could be fiction, nonfiction, news articles, blog posts, whatever it is. When you're actually engaged with the content, you're much more likely to absorb that new language almost effortlessly.
And I guess the advice is still not to get hung up on understanding every single word, right?
Absolutely, especially when you're first starting out.
Especially when you're starting out.
The focus should be on grasping the overall meaning. And your brain is, surprisingly good at inferring the meaning of unfamiliar words based on the surrounding context. And as you read more widely, you're naturally going to encounter those words again and again in different contexts. And that's really going to solidify your understanding over time.
Okay. Now, of course, in our kind of, digital world, did you see any mention of kind of language learning apps and using those digital flashcards?
Oh, definitely. I mean, language learning apps like Duolingo, Babbel, Memrise, those were highlighted as really accessible tools for incorporating, short interactive lessons into your daily routine. And they often use things like gamification and spaced repetition techniques, which can make learning more engaging and more effective.
Can you quickly kind of explain spaced repetition for people who haven't heard that term before?
Yeah. Spaced repetition is basically a learning technique that strategically revisits vocabulary and concepts at increasing intervals. So the idea is you review information more frequently when you're first learning it. And then the intervals between reviews gradually increase as that information becomes more ingrained in your memory. And this really helps to optimize memory retention because you're basically revisiting material just before you're likely to forget it.
Okay. So apps and kind of these digital flashcard systems like Anki and Quizlet, those can be, great tools for reinforcing. Now let's tackle the big one, the fear of making mistakes. Everybody I've ever spoken to who's learned another language is terrified of making mistakes. What do the sources have to say about that?
Well, I mean, it's totally understandable, right? It's a universal hurdle. But, all of the sources were really unanimous in emphasizing that mistakes are an inevitable and actually crucial part of the learning process. Every error that you make is an opportunity to identify areas for improvement and ultimately to deepen your understanding. So the key is really just to shift your perspective and not let that fear of being wrong prevent you from practicing and from communicating.
Reframing it as feedback. It's not a failure, it's feedback.
Exactly. Think of it as data that helps you understand, what you need to focus on. The more you're willing to put yourself out there to speak, even with errors, the more opportunities you create for learning and growth.
I love it. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in terms of building that solid base. Now let's get to the really fun stuff. Ooh,
okay.
Sounding more like a local.
I like it.
Your research, your review highlighted some fascinating, common phrases and expressions that people use.
Yeah. And this is where your English can really start to sound, more natural and conversational.
Right.
Because you're going beyond kind of textbook English to using those everyday expressions that native speakers use so effortlessly. And maybe we can start with something really practical, how locals ask for and give directions.
Oh, yeah, because navigating a new environment can be challenging enough without feeling like you're speaking a totally different language when you're just trying to figure out how to get somewhere.
Exactly. And instead of using really formal phrases, you might hear someone ask, "Excuse me, could you point me in the right direction for the museum?" Or maybe they say, "Is the train station far from here?"
Mm-hmm.
And then when they're giving directions, you're much more likely to hear something like, "Just head straight down this road and take the second left."
Got it.
So these informal phrases were really kind of the bread and butter of, everyday navigation.
Yeah, it sounds so much more relaxed than the things you find in a typical phrase book.
Yeah.
Now, what about when things aren't going so well? The sources talked about how locals express kind of discontent or frustration.
Yeah. And again, there are often kind of lighter and more casual ways to express that frustration. Instead of, a really strong formal complaint, you might hear someone say, "This traffic is a complete nightmare," or "I can't deal with this slow internet anymore." Or maybe something like, "That meeting was such a pain in the neck," or that really common phrase, "I'm over it," which is just kind of like, "I'm tired of dealing with this." It's all very kind of casual and everyday.
It's almost like a way to bond over those shared minor inconveniences, right?
Absolutely. It creates a sense of, connection and, shows that you're kind of in tune with the everyday realities of life in that environment.
Now, on the more positive side of things, what about making invitations and plans?
Oh, yeah. Well, this is really where that kind of informal and friendly nature of spoken English comes through. So instead of, super structured invitations, you'll often hear things like, "Do you want to hang out this weekend?" Or "We should grab coffee sometime." Or even something as simple as, "Let's catch up later." And it just conveys this idea of spending time together in a much more relaxed way.
And I like that, the sources pointed out that using those less formal phrases also can make it easier for someone to decline if they're busy without feeling awkward.
Exactly. It kind of maintains that casual, low pressure atmosphere in those social interactions.
Right. So we've looked at kind of longer phrases. Now, another thing that always adds flavor to language is how locals emphasize what they're saying. Did you find some examples of that in your review?
Oh, tons. Yeah. I mean, things like using intensifiers.
Yeah.
Like so and super to really amplify adjectives. So you're not just saying, that movie was good. You're saying, that movie was so good, or the concert was super exciting.
Right.
And then, of course, you have, that phrase literally can't even, which is a more recent one, maybe a bit overused by some,
Sure.
but it really conveys that sense of being like totally overwhelmed. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have, the very emphatic insane to describe something truly remarkable or unbelievable.
Oh my gosh, that's so true.
Yeah. So it's all about kind of adding that energy and emotion to your speech through these words.
Yeah. And even those short agreement phrases, no kidding, and you're telling me.
Yes.
Those really show that you're kind of actively listening and empathizing with what the other person is saying.
Yeah. They go beyond a simple yes and convey a much stronger sense of understanding and shared feeling.
Totally. Okay. So we've looked at longer phrases, ways to add emphasis.
Yeah.
What about those short, kind of punchy responses that just make conversations flow so much more naturally? Did you see any examples of those?
Oh, tons. Yeah. Those are essential for smooth communication. Things like no worries instead of it's okay, or you're welcome, or you bet. As very casual, of course, for sure. Yes, definitely. And then, of course, that enthusiastic, that's what I'm talking about when you really agree with something exciting.
Right.
And these little responses really show that you're engaged, you're comfortable with the kind of rhythm of the conversation.
They're like those verbal cues that keep things moving.
Exactly. They really, really contribute to sounding like a natural speaker.
Okay. Now, another area that can be tricky is navigating those social situations politely, but still sounding, authentic to yourself.
Right.
Any insights on how people do that?
Yeah. I think the key here is finding that middle ground between formality and casualness. So phrases like, sorry, I didn't catch that, are a polite yet natural way to ask someone to repeat themselves. Or, a simple, excuse me, could you help me with this, is totally acceptable in most informal situations. And then using it's no big deal to kind of reassure someone that a minor mistake or inconvenience isn't a problem.
Right. It's like you're being respectful and considerate, but you're not being overly stiff.
Exactly. And it reflects that kind of, generally relaxed and approachable communication style that you find in a lot of, English speaking cultures.
Okay. What about talking about how you're feeling?
Oh, for sure.
Were there any kind of casual expressions that kept coming up?
Yeah. Instead of kind of more formal descriptions of your feelings, you might hear someone say that they're feeling a little under the weather if they're not feeling well, or that made my day, if something positive happened. Or, expressions like on cloud nine or over the moon to convey, extreme happiness. And I'm all in is a really common casual way to just express full commitment to something.
Okay. Those are much more, relatable and kind of colorful than just saying, I am happy or I am unwell.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. They add personality and they really help you connect with others on a more kind of personal and emotional level.
Okay. Now, one thing that's really important to remember is that English isn't this uniform thing across the entire globe.
Right.
Your review touched on regional variations, which I think is so important.
Yeah, it's super important. I mean, the same idea can be expressed in, very different ways depending on where you are. And, your materials highlighted some great examples of this. The American what's up versus the British you all, right? Or the Australian g'day. Even something as simple as, wanting a cup of tea, fancy a cup of...
Yeah.
In the UK is very regionally specific. And then, of course, the Australian no worries, mate, for you're welcome is another classic.
Absolutely. So being aware of those regional differences, it can really enhance your understanding and your ability to feel more comfortable when you're interacting with people from different parts of kind of the English speaking world.
Absolutely. I mean, paying attention to those specific phrases and expressions that are used by locals in a particular region is really key to, more effective communication and a deeper understanding of that culture.
Okay. So we have covered so much ground today. we've gone from the strategies for learning more effectively to kind of diving into all these practical local phrases that people use. As we wrap things up, what are the main takeaways that you would want our listeners to keep in mind?
Well, for a faster and less stressful learning journey, I think the keys are prioritizing that everyday vocabulary, immersing yourself in English through, consistent listening and reading of engaging content, practicing speaking regularly, even if it's just to yourself, making smart use of those language learning tools, and remembering that making mistakes is absolutely a vital part of that progress.
Okay. So we have covered so much ground today. We've gone from the strategies for learning more effectively to kind of diving into all these practical local phrases that people use. As we wrap things up, what are the main takeaways that you would want our listeners to keep in mind?
I think it's really focusing on observing and incorporating those common informal phrases that are used in everyday situations. So, for asking for directions, for expressing yourself, making plans, for adding that emphasis, giving those quick responses, navigating those social situations politely, and talking about feelings in a casual way. And always remember that English has regional variations. So pay attention to the specific context.
Yeah. It's not just about knowing the dictionary definition of the word. It's about understanding those subtle ways that they're used in actual conversations.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond kind of a purely academic understanding of the language. And embracing the much more dynamic and expressive kind of language of everyday life.
This has been so helpful. I'm so glad we did this deep dive. So for everyone listening, I would say take a moment to think about all of the practical advice and examples we've discussed today. Which of these local expressions, maybe feels like it fits your personality? And consider this. What if you actively tried incorporating just one or two new phrases into your conversations this week? How might that small step, shift your confidence and the way that you connect with other English speakers?
Yeah, that's a great challenge. Experimentation and a continued curiosity are really essential for language learning.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us today. And thanks to everybody out there for tuning in to the Chatterbox English. Until next time, keep exploring.